Hi, thanks, Martin, and thank you to the BCS for inviting me today to talk about my favourite topic, which is IR35. So, as Martin said, I've been rather involved with IR35 for over 20 years. I was a contractor myself. My background is mathematics and software engineering. I was a contractor myself for 7 years and was contracting in the city for a major bank when the first wave of IR35 hit. I've even got a letter from HMRC that says IR35 does not apply to this engagement. I set up Contractor Calculator, which was originally a site around about IR35. It was called IR35 Calc at the time. That was in November 1999. And since then, I've been providing advice and guidance to the contract market for near on 2 decades. I first built an online test for IR35 status in 2009, and that was redeveloped in 2016, which then became IR35 Shield. And as Martin has explained, these days I spend lots of my time in tax tribunals. I work with my defence partner, Chris Leslie. He's ex-revenue, and he leads these cases, and I'm his right-hand man. When we're not defending ourselves, then we are also attending anything to do with status at the tax tribunal. So everything we do is kind of to a tribunal standard. A quick thing to say what we do at IR35 Shield, everything we do is about getting the compliance right, getting the right answer. We're neither sort of championing freelancers or championing clients. We just champion the whole supply chain and the flexible workforce and just try and get those wheels turning so that people can easily work in a manner without too much friction. We also do sort of services to stress test people's compliance and so on, mainly the clients, to make sure they're getting things right. That's kind of what we're all about these days. Now, I guess the thing is that we're just all about doing fair assessments, helping people. Right, this presentation, this is pitched for people who possibly know nothing about IR35. So I'm going to go through some of the differences between the old and the new legislation and go through some terminology and so on. And then I'll explain what's happened in the last few years, talk about our favorite tool out there, CEST, and also talk about some of the things that have happened recently and who's got the tax liability, some insurance things that have been going on, and best practices. So without further ado, I'll go on to terminology. So everyone talks about IR35. There's no such thing actually in statute called IR35. It stands for the 35th press release. I believe it was in February 1999 by the Inland Revenue, hence IR, that announced that this was going to be a thing. And that thing is the Intermediaries Legislation, which is in Chapter 8 of the Finance Act. The Income Taxes, Earnings and Pensions Act. So that sometimes referred to that as Chapter 8 if we're being all geeky. And the new thing that came in 2017 in the public sector and in the private sector, 2021, that's the off-payroll legislation. So they both coexist. The off-payroll legislation is used when a contractor is working either for a public sector organization or for a medium or large company, and we'll come on to that. So we have something called the Small Companies Exemption, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there are differences in terms of the tax treatment between the original IR35 and the new IR35. I might refer to them as Chapter 8 or Chapter 10, or I might refer to them as original rules, new rules, that kind of thing. So the common thing, though, is this concept of a deemed employee. And that means you ignore the fact that there's a limited company and you examine the relationship between the contractor and the firm that they're working for. You apply all of the status tests, the employment status case law, and determine whether or not that relationship is one of employment. It doesn't really matter what the person does, whether they're a carpenter or an engineer or whatever. It's the nature of the relationship and how that engagement operates that helps us understand whether or not that is one of employment. And in tax terms, we would call that a deemed employee. So then when we do that, we're looking to establish what we refer to as the IR35 status. Is somebody a deemed employee or not? Are they inside IR35, which is the common phrase we use now, inside or outside IR35. Previously, we might have been using things like IR35 applies, it's within, it's caught, it's failed. But these days we're saying inside IR35 or outside IR35. Outside IR35 is where everybody wants to operate, because that's genuinely a relationship that's one of services and not of providing an individual who is in a master-servant relationship. So all the paid is where contractors are considered to be inside IR35. And people use that same terminology, inside or outside, whether we're talking about the original rules or the new rules. So here's what happened. We spent the first 17 years of our lives under the Intermediaries Legislation. This is the blue bit in here. And then in 2017, after much discussion for a year or so and consultations, and failing to campaign against it at that point, they introduced it into the public sector, the off-payroll working legislation. And then a few years later, after a couple of years delay, they then rolled out the off-payroll legislation to the private sector. The original intention was to completely replace the Intermediaries Legislation. However, that wasn't going to get through Parliament. The concern was that it would be too onerous for the roughly 5 million small businesses in the UK who may hire freelancers who are running their own limited companies. So instead, they said this only applies if the client to which the contractor is working is medium or large, and the medium, large and small is defined in the Corporation Tax Act. And I think I've got something on that later I can share with you. So we've got this bit here called the Small Companies Exemption. There's also another exemption if you are working for, if you're a contractor, you're working for a firm that's overseas, because that company is wholly overseas. The off-payroll legislation does not apply because that firm is not in the UK. So therefore you would be doing your own assessments just like you were for the last 22 years. So that's what's going on. Now, the differences between them. This column here is the old rules. This is the new rules. So in the old world, the contractor did the assessment. In the new world, the client does the assessment. In the old world, the contractor did the assessment every tax year based on things that had taken place, based on the work that they had done, based on the earnings that they had earned for that work. However, under the off-payroll legislation, the assessment needs to be done before the payment is made. So what we tend to find now happens is that clients are doing these assessments before the contract even starts. It's the sensible thing to do, based on what the expectations are and how the contract will be carried out and how it will be conducted. So there's a before that going on there. Tax liability. In the old world, the contractor had to pay the tax. In the new world, the client or the agency, recruitment agency, if there is one, they become something called the fee payer, and they hold the tax liability. And as we'll see later on, the contractor has absolutely no tax liability at all under the off-payroll legislation. The other key thing is the treatment of employers' national insurance. In the old rules, if you're a contractor and your income is considered deemed employment, then you have to reverse out an amount of money to account for employers' NI, which is 13.8%. Oh, it's just gone up, hasn't it? It's just gone up another 1.25. So 15%-ish. So you have to reverse that out to then come to a number which would be a deemed salary, such that when you apply the employer's NI, you get to the number you first thought of. So you end up with a deemed salary. So you're effectively paying, as a contractor, that employer's NI yourselves. Under the new rules, if your contract with the client says the same thing, say £500 a day, lucky you, then that employer's NI is paid on top by the client or the agency being the fee payer. It can't be deducted from your contract wage. What you will find is that some firms will say, well, you can only engage with us via an umbrella company. And when that happens, that rate that you thought was yours isn't really yours anymore. That belongs to the umbrella company, and it kind of returns you back to the position that you would have been in under the Intermediaries Legislation. You're paying two lots of tax. So your effective rate of tax on that money will be much more than an employee would be paying. But if you get into that situation, you just need to renegotiate your rate. You need to know what you're getting into. So that's the differences between them. So the Intermediaries Legislation, left-hand side here, we've got the tax risk sitting with the contractor's company. And under the new legislation, we have the tax risk sits with the client or it sits with the agency, depending on some nuances that I'll come on to on the next slide. The Intermediaries Legislation still applies when the client you're working for is a small company. And a small company is if you stay a small company, provided that you do not breach 2 out of 3 of these rules. These are in the Companies Act 2006, it's defined there. So you don't actually have to be that small to be a small company. If you've got less than 50 employees, you're a small company. Your balance sheet mustn't be more than 5.1 million. It'd be nice to have £5 million on your balance sheet, wouldn't it? Your annual turnover mustn't exceed 10 million. So these small companies that can actually be quite big, I guess. And what we are seeing in the sector is that there are lots of small niche consultancies that are providing services to end clients. And when they do this, those consultancies are actually the client, not the end client at the top, because there's no personal service being provided to those end clients. There's a service proposition being provided by the consultancy. So when that happens, the consultancy is small and all the contractors that are working through that consultancy, they're all operating under the Intermediaries Legislation, and the off-payroll rules don't have to be considered. But it's quite complex. I do a whole webinar on the small companies exemption. I'm doing the next one on April the 20th, if you want to come and see that. Right, so a bit of terminology. We have this concept of the chain. The chain is all of the people, the parties. In legislation, it's called the person. Person can be a business or a contractor, a worker. So the chain is everyone in the supply chain. Then the worker is defined as, well, it's basically the contractor, and the client is the one where the contractor is providing a personal service to. So you can see that if this middle agency here was actually a consultancy instead, then we wouldn't have the situation where personal service is being provided to this client, because the contractor's working for the consultancy, not providing their personal services to the client. The consultancy is providing a block of services to the client. So we have the fee payer. That's the one that's just above the contractor's limited company, but that can switch about based on some things that I'll tell you about in a second. The intermediary, that's your limited company. So the key focus here really is who is the client. So let's say we're not talking about consultancy world. We'll say there's a recruitment agency in the chain, because that's quite typical. Now, the idea is that the client is the one that has to do the assessment. I say has to, they don't actually have to do an assessment. There is nothing in law that says they must do produce a status determination statement. There are just consequences if they don't. So the general idea, and these concepts of status determination statements were brought in 2021. They didn't exist in the 2017 version of the legislation. The idea of these status determination statements is that, firstly, the tax gets paid. And secondly, the contractor gets a fair crack of the whip of being assessed correctly. That's the general idea. And the reason this works is that the client, they'll do an assessment and then they create a document called a status determination statement. And for that to be considered valid, as in it is a status determination statement, the conclusion within that statement must have been reached with the client exercising reasonable care. Now, that's a concept in tax law, and it means basically that they can't have been negligent. So they can't just blanket assess people, say it's inside. They're supposed to actually consider it properly, consider all of the rules, and actually make a considered determination, not being negligent. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it must also contain reasons for the determination. Now, then what happens is when that status determination statement is passed to the contractor and down the supply chain, with that status determination statement is attached the tax risk. The idea being that if it says it's inside, then the client is absolved of having to owe the tax because they've told someone else to pay it. And the agency then has to make sure that they pay the tax because they are, in law, the ones responsible for it. So they can't just go and bury the tax risk in the back garden and pay the contractor gross. They are liable for that money. So that's the idea, is to, if it's an inside SDS, then the tax gets paid. Now, if it's an outside SDS, then the client doesn't actually really need to pass it down the chain or give it to the worker, but and there's nothing in law that says that they do, but in practice, that tends to be what is happening. So that's what happens. Now, there is a slight flaw within the legislation whereby if an outside SDS is passed down the supply chain and it's valid and everything, and the client has exercised reasonable care, then HMRC at a later date could potentially step in and say, well, actually, whilst you adhere to reasonable care, we still disagree with the decision and we think that that was an engagement that should have been inside Ir35. But they can't go after the client because reasonable care has been met. They would have to go after the agency and give the agency a new tax bill. That's how the legislation is currently set up. It's bizarre. There should really be some mechanism perhaps for getting it back off the client. Some agencies have indemnifications and warranties and so on in their contracts that then push it back up to the client, but it's a kind of a contractual matter. It's just a bit of a flaw that's going on at the moment. It's unfair on agencies. So that's the theory of what everyone was supposed to do and kind of what is happening, although there are many firms that are just, to start with, they refuse to engage with the new legislation. And given the timings of when it came in, I kind of don't blame them, really. There were lots of companies under pressure from the pandemic. Contractors are first to go. Lots of those were put on the bench. Firms found it easy to hire contractors remotely and say that they all had to go on payroll rather than off payroll. The supply-demand curve was slightly skewed. Firms had large numbers of contractors, thousands, some of them, whereby it was kind of obvious that many of them really should have been paying taxes as if they were inside IR35, but weren't. Some of them were very dusty. You hear stories of contractors having been in the same place for 5 or 10 years. I think one was even 15 years we came across. So firms didn't want to start handing out all these official documents saying to these contractors, here you go, this says that really you're supposed to be an employee, even though we've been hiring you this way, because they may well have found lots of applications to employment tribunals for rights and unpaid holiday pay and all of that. So they didn't want any of that. So with much of the confusion in the market and with very little time to really get themselves up to speed on this, because it takes at least 6 months to put in a good regime, they just pressed the reset button and they said, right, no more contractors operating through limited companies from here on in. Let's see how it goes. And that was not good for them. It wasn't good for contractors, wasn't good for the market, it wasn't good for the projects. This is a survey that we did in November 2021, sort of followed on from other surveys that we had done, really. And much of these just say the same thing. It just didn't really go very well, but you wouldn't expect it to. There's always going to be firms that leave things to the last minute. And I would say it happened more so this time because of the pandemic. It just wasn't fair for many firms, many contractors. So there was lots of blanket bans. Lots of work's been moved offshore. And that's something actually as a contractor you can do and take advantage of, because if you're working for a company that's wholly overseas, as I said earlier, you use the original legislation, you're not under the new rules. And firms as well, they're bringing in contractors remotely from offshore, because if they do that, then they don't have to engage with the off-payroll rules. So we've got this bizarre situation where it kind of makes sense and is more frictionless to not work for a company in your own country. The other thing we found that lots of people were using CEST. CEST hasn't got the greatest reputation. I'll come on to CEST in a bit anyway. Lots of contractors just voted with their feet. So it was all a bit of a mess, really. So what we're now seeing is that where firms cannot engage the talent that they need if they don't implement a solid IR35 regime that isn't just blanket banning, then they are starting to lift those blanket bans. We found actually this year, from January onwards, was the first time companies said, okay, we need to do something about this. So we have had many new clients come on since January, lifting blanket bans and sort of starting from scratch. Because there are contractors that just simply will not work on an inside IR35 basis. And frankly, if they're genuinely self-employed and the relationship is not one of deemed employment, then why shouldn't they? You know, it seems perfectly fair. And if firms want them, they have to do things properly, and they can do things properly. It's entirely manageable, this piece of legislation. It's just something that needs to be done. And for many firms, it's just a headache, because you have to get so many departments involved. We're also seeing firms move away from CEST because it sets the bar too high when it comes to determinations. It's really annoying when it comes to workflow, and administration doesn't provide any tools for that. And other reasons which I'll come on to. So firms are kind of revisiting things they've done in the past. Maybe they can do things better. They kind of had a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to it. And the other thing we're seeing is contractors are becoming a lot more knowledgeable about IR35. I would say prior to these reforms coming in, a large portion of the market didn't really pay much heed to IR35, but now they kind of have to. The thing to understand about IR35 is that you probably don't want to try and understand IR35, certainly in terms of working out the status yourselves. This is something I've spent 20 years doing, more than 20 years now, and it's still a massive headache. The law is evolving at the moment. There are cases going through the tribunals that will have quite an impact actually on the way status is being categorized. There's just tons and tons of case law that goes back almost a decade. So the key here is to just ask someone to help you do it. That will actually, if you get an expert in to help you manage your IR35 status, then that would demonstrate more reasonable care. If you are the contractor and you're doing it yourself, HMRC, if they come after you and they say that you owe them more tax for the Intermediaries Legislation, like there have been about 40 cases now, then if you had actually engaged an expert to help you, then that would demonstrate you've taken reasonable care. If you did it yourself and you made a bit of a hash of it, they might say you've been careless, and that would extend the inquiry window by 6 years. So just by spending a few $100, you can demonstrate reasonable care and close down the size of the inquiry window. Right. The other thing to say is HMRC admitted in the case called Payer, going back to, I think, 2018, in their witness evidence, that they spend between 3 and 5 years training their own inspectors on employment status. I don't think you can learn it in 3 years, but there you go. Right, a bit more about CEST. So a bit of history on this. So when HMRC proposed that they wanted to change, or dare I say, use the word reform IR35, Parliament told them, you can't do this because it will introduce lots of uncertainty in the tax system. Well, we don't want uncertainty in the tax system. Everyone's supposed to have finality with their tax. So Parliament told HMRC, you can only do this if you build a tool online to help people assess their status. That's what happened. So HMRC went about building a tool. They were late to the game. They spent about, when did they even start building that tool? Crikey. I think they probably started in 2016. It came out theirs didn't come out until about, was it like 4 weeks before, March 2017, I think, something like that. It was rather rushed. If you look under the bonnet of the tool, you can see what they were trying to do, and that I would say that they coded themselves into an algorithmic cul-de-sac. You know how, like, well, you're all techies, so you know how you're not supposed to build frameworks. They built a framework, and then they tried to make all of the cases fit within the framework they've done, where really they should have built it a case at the time and let the framework evolve in an agile manner. I'm glad I can say that to an audience who might understand what I'm talking about. So they kind of did it the wrong way around, and they ended up with what they've got. I would say that looking at the way in which they've weighted everything, they've realized that, oh, it didn't quite do what we wanted to do. So therefore, and because they're HMRC, they have to provide certainty. They set the bar really high to say somebody is outside IR35. And then they've got that whole 21% section below that saying, we don't know. And then the rest are inside. So that's what they did. They had a pretty good go at it. It was kind of an impossible job in a short space of time. And firms are just finding that it's not really enough for them. The National Audit Office released a report in February this year that studied the implementation of the IR35 off payroll reforms, and they basically told them that they needed to improve CEST. We know that government bodies that used CEST, I'm absolutely pillaring it here now. We know that government bodies that use CEST and followed HMRC's guidance are facing tax bills of £263 million. So it kind of is, it is what it is. So most of the time it will push people inside IR35 because it's very risk averse, or it will say don't know. And if it's outside IR35, you have to be really careful. This is probably more for the clients that use CEST rather than the contractors. If you're told outside IR35, you just say thanks very much and crack on. But for clients, it doesn't really provide a very robust defense. And that's because the nature at which it goes around doing the assessments. I could spend forever on this, but I won't right now. But if you have clients that are using CEST and you perhaps think they shouldn't, then by all means introduce them to us. I can chat to them in an hour and make their faces go pale. If you are going to dispute a CEST assessment, then we have a guide on our site about how to go about doing that. When you're given an inside determination, you can dispute this. It's section 61T of the legislation. It's this client-led dispute process. There was going to be access to a tax tribunal as mentioned in the original consultations, but that just kind of vanished really, and they ended up with this client marks their own homework thing. It's kind of silly. Some clients will actually consider the feedback that you've given them, but most of them will just say, sorry, they'll just say, we don't agree with the representations you've been made, and the answer stands, what you want to do. And then maybe you'll negotiate a different rate, or maybe you'll vote with your feet. You can try and dispute, but I'm not sure you'll get anywhere really. Right, the firms that will worry about giving out too many inside determinations, they will get worried and start doing something else instead of using CEST when too many contractors vote with their feet. It all mixes in with the supply demand curve. Okay, so back onto education. This is a freebie for you that we built the other week. So this is something we built on IR35 Shield to help educate you. I don't know if you know, I've also wrote this book. It's a while ago now. You can get that on Amazon. I think it's about a tenner. You can get the first 4 chapters of it in if you register with Ir35 Shield for free. So we built these fun sort of quizzes, challenge, what we called them, upskill challenges, I think the guys called them. I'd set all of the questions, obviously. And you could get a couple of these for free, and it helps educate you. So you say the answers, then you go back and it educates you on what's going on. So you can get those. That might help you a bit, might help with your disputes if you have any. Right, what else did the National Audit Office say when their report came out? So this point here, I've got 4 slides here I'm going to show you. And the upshot of this is that if you're a contractor and you're working for a medium or large firm and they've hired you on an outside IR35 basis, you do not have any tax risk going forward. The only risk you might have is if you've signed an indemnity with the agency or client if there's no agency. And on the topic of indemnities, you really need to have those checked because some of them are incredibly onerous and you would be mad to sign them. So what did the NAO say? They said, and this is what's really bizarre, if HMR step in and override a determination, and they say it's not outside, it's inside, they claim the full amount of tax off of the client or the fee, whichever the fee payer is, which is both sets of employers NI and the PAYE, and the contractor gets a full tax refund and pays no tax. I'm not joking. That's what happens. We couldn't believe it either. We'd been looking at this for about 2 years, as have lots of other tax experts. Representations had been made to HMRC. There should have been another statutory instrument written alongside the Finance Act, but it didn't happen, and we've ended up in this situation. So after that news came out in February, that was followed up by the Public Accounts Committee. They also were reading the report and shone a torch on this particular aspect, and the head of HMRC also confirmed that contractors just get a tax refund, claim for repayment. And this was then picked up by the Financial Times. It's actually Emma, she phoned me up and she said, did you see the Public Accounts Committee confirmed what you were saying about the so-and-so? And I said, no, I didn't, I haven't seen it yet because I was planning on watching it on a recording. And so it's quite amusing to have a journalist ringing me up and briefing me about what happened. It's normally the other way around. So yes, this was a thing. That's what happened. I'm labouring the point a bit, and you'll see why. So there are insurance products in the market that contractors are being asked to buy that allegedly protects the tax, not just the costs of the investigation, the tax loss itself, and that they also protect the agency and the client and everyone in the supply chain. Well, I'm sorry, but that doesn't work. Those policies can't work because the person who buys an insurance policy needs to have an insurable interest, as defined on this slide by the Association of British Insurers. And if there's no insurable interest, that policy is void in law. So those don't work. The person that needs to buy any, I mean, I'm not a big fan of tax loss policies, but if someone's going to buy one, it needs to be the person that has the risk, which would be the client or the agency. A contractor cannot buy an insurance policy to protect someone else's tax liability. You can't insure someone else to drive their car, and your neighbor can't insure your house in case it burns down. This is just very standard stuff. Neither does, if you sign an indemnity, create that insurable interest, because that's a separate thing. That would be a contractual risk rather than a tax risk. So none of that works. Don't buy those, and be really, really careful, because some of you may be mindful of the managed service companies legislation. It's been in the news recently. If you go to the front page of Contractor Calculator, the other site that I own, you'll see discussions about managed service companies. HMRC are going on the attack with this one. I think it's a little bit unjustified, but it's still happening. Now, one of the reasons, if your accountant is considered to be a managed service company provider, and you are a managed service company, then you have to pay tax as if it was employment money, employment income. So you'll end up with a bigger tax bill. Going back 6 years, possibly at least 4, and you'll have to pay that irrespective of your IR35 position. It doesn't even matter if you're outside IR35, you owe the money. You do not want to get yourself involved with that. And one of the reasons that your accountant or someone above you in the chain, which might be the agency, could be considered a managed service company provider is if they are promoting tax loss insurance. So someone's telling you to buy and promoting tax loss insurance, you just need to be extremely careful. We've written about this. It's on IR35 Shield. Just be very, very mindful about that. Right, so what's happening? What's going to happen in the future? Let's get the DeLorean out. IR35, off payroll, whatever we want to call it, it's not going to be repealed. I can't see that happening. We tried to stop it getting onto the statute. We almost got a delay for 2 years. We needed just over 40 rebel MPs. This is going back to July 2020, after I led that 4-year Stop the Off Payroll Tax campaign. We tried to stop it happening. We had over 40 rebels on the day when the vote was going to be in Parliament to delay it for another 2 years. We had the whole Labour Party on board. You may remember we came out with this whole zero rights employment thing. They were on board. Liberal Democrats were on board. So the whole opposition were on board for the amendment that David Davis had put forward for a 2-year delay. We had over 40. Drum roll. Which politician do you think it was went round and spoke to all the rebels and convinced them, well, convinced all bar, I think 16, not to vote for the amendment? He's in the news at the moment. His name is Boris Johnson. So there you go. That's why we've got it. Right. Number 2, the small companies exemption. I think this will fall away at some point when HMRC have claimed success and everything's bedded in. Because firms at the moment, if they hire sole traders, they have tax risk. There's no reason why they shouldn't have to, can't get rid of this exemption, really. They just have to make sure things have settled down, the case law settled down a bit. So I think it'll be in 1 or 2 years, probably 2 years. But at the moment, small companies exemption can be extremely useful for you, because if you're working for a consultancy that is small and the services being provided are fully contracted out, which means they're not just a body shop, okay? Then the original rules apply, everyone knows what they're doing, and you should be able to carry on contracting in a position where you're outside IR35. It's not a tax loophole. This isn't a way for you to avoid paying the right amount of tax, and you definitely shouldn't do that. But getting in with lots of small consultancies might be a very good route to market for you, in addition to working for overseas companies. Number 3, if you are working under the Intermediaries Legislation, the original rules, do not use CES to protect yourself. That itself is not enough. Make sure you either use us or one of our competitor firms, and make sure you have tax defense costs insurance. That's different to tax loss insurance. Tax defense costs, typically 125,000. If you're a member of IR35 Shield, you get it. Even if you're only a member for 3 months, which costs 60 quid, you get it. And there's a 4-year runoff period. So this doesn't cost much. Just please make sure you have tax defense costs insurance if you are a limited company. Because the bills are massive if you try and defend one of these IR35 cases. We work on cases, we do insurance jobs, you can burn through 100K very quickly, typically, especially if you're using a barrister and it goes from the first tier to the upper tier. Can easily happen, it's very expensive. Make sure you don't want to be paying for that yourself. Right, I've already said, talked about number 5, be careful of managed service company legislation. And if you have any clients, please refer them to IR35 Shield, and we're trying to help them. We actually did one of those recently. A contractor came to us, and the firm they're working for, they knew them very well. They hadn't got things right, and yeah, we ended up helping them out and putting in a regime for them so they could do things right, which was quite nice. Right, I'm now ready for questions, Martin. Is Martin there? He is.
I am, once I can come off mute. No problem at all.
42 minutes. Look at that.
Excellent timing. Thank you very much. So if everybody would like, if they'd like to ask questions, either feel free to do so in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute so you can come and ask questions. So do we have any coming in for Dave, please? And you raise your hand, by the way, by clicking on the reactions on the bottom bar. Okay. We have our first question.
Hello, good evening. Thanks, Dave. I follow you on LinkedIn and you have lots of great content, and thanks for the webinar today. So since the start of IR35, I've been working for companies that are abroad. So I did one in the Middle East for a company in the Middle East and Qatar, and now for one in Amsterdam. So my clients weren't very sure about IR35, and I thought I was exempt because, you know, that they're out of the country. So I just want to confirm. I think I did hear you say that, but the fact that my clients are no longer in the UK means that I'm exempt. Is that correct?
That's right. So the firm you're working for needs to be wholly overseas. It cannot have any permanent establishment in the UK. There's some good guidance actually on the HMRC website about this, but you could always check with HMRC via your accountant on a no names basis to confirm that kind of thing. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Okay. Do we have any other questions, please? Okay, we've got one coming through on chat.
Okay.
So over 60 self-employed technical assessor. If an organization wants to use the services on an ad hoc basis, where if does IR35 apply?
So this person is a technical assessor, and an organization wants to use their services on an ad hoc basis. I mean, you have to look at all of the factors when assessing a particular engagement. This is just one saying it's ad hoc. That doesn't sound like it's one of employment, deemed employment. You've probably had an overarching contract, and you would probably then agree to do a piece of work here and there on a piecemeal basis. That's kind of akin to, it's a bit like the professional referees case that's potentially going to the Supreme Court, but you don't actually have any, I'm imagining, any ongoing obligation to do the next piece of work and the next piece of work. There's possibly, I would like to see offer an acceptance in between any of those pieces of work that you do. And that should be enough itself. The substitution probably doesn't come into play. You're probably doing the work personally. I'm sort of speculating a bit here. If you're a technical assessor, I doubt they're telling you how to do your work. So that would probably be neutral. And then you would be agreeing up front what it is you're going to do your technical assessing on, rather than just turning up and being asked and being pointed what to go and work on, in which case the scope for control would be quite narrow, I'd imagine. And therefore, where that's the case, we'd probably then want to look at whether you're actually in business on your own account, more of a sort of a Hall versus Lorimer, stand back, look at the whole picture thing. And you might have multiple clients that you're doing this technical assessing for. You might have a website as well, you know. So you start to then build that up, and the picture itself looks like one of typically self-employment and not one of employer.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question from Andy. Hi, Andy. Can't hear you, unfortunately. I can see that you're off mute, but we can't hear you. Still not, unfortunately. Feel free to pop it into the chat window, Andy, if you'd like to. Do we have any other questions? And then we can always come back.
Someone's saying they think CEST looks a bit like a chocolate teapot. I've heard someone say that before. The thing is with CEST is that it's actually HMRC's policy view of what status is, not necessarily what the law says, and it can be different to what the law actually says. You have to be really careful with it. I wouldn't use it, but you know, I guess I'm slightly got vested interest in saying that. But the thing is, if you use it, HMRC will come along and say you answered the wrong questions and you should have answered them this way, and therefore it means this, so therefore your court give us your money. Whereas if you just don't go near it, they have to argue in a different way.
So we've had a couple more come through just on chat.
Okay.
So
yeah, what we got?
Could you explain a bit more about the consultancy option for sole traders? And then there's another one as well.
I don't know about sole traders. So a sole trader is someone that isn't operating through a limited company. They're just a sole trader. So that's a sole trader. If you're a company and you hire a sole trader, if HMRC step in and say, I'm sorry, but really they were an employee, you as the hirer have to pay tons of extra taxes, same as off payroll working. And that's been around, I can't remember when it came in, but we're talking about 30 years ago, something like that. And that's why the whole market moved to where individuals would start using limited companies. So there was no tax risk left on the balance sheet for that hiring firm, and it was a nice clean hire. So if we now go into sort of the working for a consultancy, to explain that one again, because in the statute, it says that the client is defined as the party to which the worker provides personal services. A consultancy does not provide personal services. It provides services. Fix this, make this. Oh, I'll get 5 people together to build the bridge and kind of thing, you know. So they take on the whole control and the contract for delivering that service. And then the consultancy decides who they use. So therefore, that client and the worker are not connected in a way whereby there's a personal service relationship. So it means the consultancy is the client. And because the consultancy is the client, we then ask, is it small, medium, or large? And if it's small, the new rules do not apply. That's how that one works. Is there another quick question on there?
There is. So could you clarify the comment about tax refund? Did you say if the HMRC considers it deemed employment, that they will take tax from both the client agency and the contractor, but then there's an expectation that the contractor has to claim the full refund?
Okay, it's not quite like that. So let me do that one again.
Okay.
Now, under the original legislation, let's say HMRC step in and the Intermediaries Legislation applies, you're running through your own limited company, you would have to pay all the extra tax, and you typically would have a tax bill of, let's say, 100 grand or 200 grand. But all the taxes you've already paid, including the corporation tax and income tax on all your dividends, that all gets offset. So you only end up paying the extra bit you should pay. So when you see some of these bills in the market, for example, Gary Lineker, almost £5 million, he doesn't owe £5 million. In fact, he was running through an LLP. You probably want to take about a third of that. So that's what happens in Chapter 8. In the new world, Chapter 10, there is no offset mechanism. So any taxes the contractor has paid for the contractor's company, corporation tax or any income tax on the dividends, they can claim that back, and it cannot be offset for the client's new bill, because that money that the contractor's got is now considered to be net of tax under the legislation, which means they never needed to pay any tax on it in the first place. So the contractor ends up paying no tax. The client has to pay all the employer's NI, employees NI, and the PAYE, which is probably about 50% of the cost of the contractor. And the only way for the client to get money back from the contractor is to have something in the contractual arrangements upon which have been signed. So it would be sensible for the client or the agency to obligate the contractor to put in for the tax refund and pay some of those monies back to the client or the agency. Hopefully that explains it.
Yeah, it certainly made sense. Absolutely. Have we got any other questions coming through? Any more hands? And there we go. So just had a response saying it does explain it perfectly. Thank you.
Ah, perfect. There's one by Andy on the chat.
There we go. Okay. Would you like me to read it out?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi, Dave. I've currently worked for a client for a couple of years providing project management services. They are now clamping down on long-term contractors. I'm now setting up a new joint company to provide dedicated deployment services where we will provide teams of people to provide the end-to-end services against statements of works.
Nice.
Each piece of work will be quoted on its own merits. We'll be recruiting perm and contract resource to flex up and down. So we know we will have to have our own internal IR35 considerations, but in terms of how we do business with the end client, do we need to be concerned about IR35?
Brilliant question. Yeah, very good. So theoretically, so you're setting up as a consultancy, you're going to be small, so you're in that sweet spot. You don't have to do anything with IR35 because essentially it's the contractor's problem now, isn't it? The ones that you hire. However, it would not be a good idea for you to be seen to be facilitating the use of limited companies in order to avoid tax and all that kind of thing. So we would recommend that you implement a regime whereby you are assessing those contractors anyway, and you can demonstrate to your client that you have that due diligence in place. That's a good sales point for you. Your clients, assuming they're medium or large, will be worried about this. And they will be worried about off-payroll IR35 because they'll be worried that HMRC will step in and say, your consultancy is not really a consultancy. You're just providing bodies. Now, if they do that, if HMR step in and do that, then it flips immediately to off-payroll working. And the client didn't do any status determination statements. They didn't pass those down the chain. They didn't pass the tax risk to an agency or the tax risk to you. It sits with them. It's building up on their balance sheet over time. So the clients are very highly likely to want to do due diligence on you to make sure that you are really a consultancy. So contractual due diligence, sounding like my Norwich accent is coming out. They'll be wanting to do due diligence on you to make sure that you are really providing services. There is no reasonable care provision in Chapter 10, the new legislation, whereby if a firm reasonably concludes that you are a consultancy and therefore off-payroll doesn't apply, then they're no longer hit with the tax risk. So it's a bit of a gap in the legislation, which is why you'll probably be expected to operate as if it applies to you.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully that answers your question, Andy. Do we have any more questions coming in? In addition to Andy's question, would the end client at all be involved in the selection process of these resources? Would that make any difference?
You have to be really careful with that. We've just been advising a consultant firm specifically about that. There's a way you have to go about it. There's nothing wrong with the end client checking that the people that you are supplying are qualified to deliver the services, but they should not have an unqualified veto to just turf people off site or say they can't work there. If that's the case, it looks like you're just an employment business providing bodies. Yeah,
agreed. Okay, another great question. Any other questions coming through? Conscious that we've only got a couple more minutes, so maybe time for one or two other questions. No, nothing at the moment. Dave, just to pass on my thanks. I feel wholly more informed than I did an hour ago. So thank you very much. And I'm sure, testament to how many people we've had engaging with us today and some great questions as well, is that it is still and will remain, I'm sure, a topic that people still are thriving for more information to keep them informed and up to date with things.